All right, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. I see folks trickling in now. Um, but yeah, thank you all for joining today. We'll give folks another few moments to join, and then we'll get started. All right, well, let's go ahead. Thank you all for joining today. Yeah, I think we live in a real time of change in this country, and that includes for our early childhood systems. And that change brings urgency, real urgency, but also an opportunity now to consider what comes next. And I'd argue, as a data advocate, that building more coherent, more functional, more equitable early childhood systems needs to be informed by the best data we have, the most useful information we can create. And unfortunately, for myriad reasons, which we'll touch on today, to date, early childhood data systems in this country have largely not been able to deliver that data to meet people's information needs. But again, I am an advocate. There is hope. Better data, better early childhood data systems are possible. And, some states are showing the way. And that's the topic of today's conversation. What is possible with better early childhood data? So I am Charlie Rosemond. I'm an advisor leading early childhood work for the Data Quality Campaign, or DQC. DQC is a national level nonpartisan policy and advocacy nonprofit, and we're focused specifically on ensuring that data works for people, that people have the information they need to make informed decisions. So DQC, Elliot and I were just talking. DQC we're in our 20th anniversary this year. So the organization's been around. We work across states, but I think most importantly, we work across early childhood, K-12, higher ed, and the workforce. That complete P20W, I'd argue prenatal through workforce spectrum. So we are focused again on ensuring that people across that spectrum have the information they need when they need it to make decisions and take action. So I am thrilled to be joined today by Elliot Regenstein, a partner with Foresight Law and Policy. Elliot has extensive experience in state level policy and advocacy with a particular focus on early learning. He's consulted with more than 24 states on a wide range of education policy topics, with much of his work focusing on how decision making occurs in state education and early education systems, namely who is responsible for which decisions, what information they have to support those decisions, and what incentives are acting on key stakeholders. He is a frequent author and speaker on a lot of topics, including accountability, governance, state data systems, and the connections between early learning and K-12. And last but not least, Harvard Education Press recently published Elliot's second book titled Readiness: Preparing State Early Childhood Systems for a Brighter Future. Elliot, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me here, Charlie. It's always a pleasure to talk about this topic. And having worked with Data Quality Campaign going back almost to its founding, it's an honor to be here.
Awesome. Well, speaking for DQC and my colleagues here, grateful for your long-term partnership. Thanks again for taking the time. This was a pretty easy sell getting you here today, but yeah, really appreciate you contributing your expertise. So I will stop sharing and we'll get into it. But yeah, the plan for today, Elliot and I are going to work through a few different data-related topics in this space. We are holding time at the end for questions, but please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to hit them as we go. No guarantees, but again, we are holding time at the end for questions. So thanks in advance for your engagement today, and we will get going. So Elliot, again, like what's possible? We're hopeful today. We're aiming for like what comes next. But I think I always feel obligated to kind of consider the current state and how we got here. And as I alluded, like early childhood data systems in this country have largely not delivered to date. And so the question is why? So like what are some of the biggest reasons, the biggest challenges that states have faced in this data space?
Sure. Well, it's a good question, and having lived with this issue for a long time, I certainly have some thoughts. The one of the key pieces, and that this is an area where I think the field has made a lot of progress in the course of the last 20 years, is who's demanding data, right? The demand side is critical because maintaining the infrastructure to produce data takes a fair amount of time and energy. And if there isn't really a demand for it, then it can be hard to justify that. So one of the things that you've seen over the course of the last 20 years is an elevation of early childhood within state policy spaces, right? Historically, early childhood was administered in multiple pieces in multiple different agencies, and that each agency had whatever data it needed for its own reporting and compliance purposes. But there wasn't even anyone in state government whose full-time job was thinking about how the system fit together as a whole. But you're seeing that increasingly change. There are some states that have had unified early childhood agencies going back to even before the creation of DQC, but the number of such agencies has grown in recent years, and there are also a number of states that have created elevated units within existing agencies, often education agencies, that bring together multiple programs that used to be in different agencies and are then being very aggressive about using data in a cross program way. So that demand side has been a game changer. And again, there are places where that's further along than others. Another piece of it, though, is that the technology of data collection and integration is improving, and state government isn't usually on the cutting edge of taking advantage of that. But you're seeing a rise in the use of improved data at the collection end, right? A lot of childcare providers using childcare management systems, systems that in some places are still pencil and paper, right? Like hopefully a lot less than in past years, but that we're making progress on that front. And that at the state level, the technology to take data from different services and integrate it has also improved rapidly. It is worth noting that there was a major wave of activity on developing early childhood integrated data systems funded by the Early Learning Challenge during the Obama administration. And that was a bipartisan effort that was, in states of all political stripes. And there was a great deal of energy expended, but a number of struggles that states had. The technology at the time, again, it was 10 to 15 years ago. The technology was not where it is today. And the political processes inherent in building integrated data systems are also very difficult. So even with the grant, states struggled to actually produce the data they were looking to produce. And that created sort of two different sets of problems. One was in some states, they thought, well, like we had this federal money, we tried it, it didn't work. How are we ever going to do this? Right. And that created a little bit of a dead zone for some time. There were other states where they actually built something that didn't really work the way they intended it to. But once you've built it, that was occupying the space and was sort of hard. It didn't leave room for states to update their approach necessarily. And so both of those ghosts, if you will, have hung over certain states for the last few years. But I do think you're now getting to the point where states are really committed to moving forward. They're doing some exciting things, and hopefully we'll have a lot of optimistic things to talk about today.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, so let's start climbing. I'm really so readiness, your recent book. You had this really succinct closer. States, and I'll paraphrase, states working towards building a data culture based on curiosity, trust, and speed, and kind of underlying that, this combination of the demand and the supply kind of data-informed inquiry, but also having the data systems, the infrastructure in place to actually, deliver the data to answer those questions. So I figure we can start with the demand side. What are some of, like, we at DQC are things starting with questions? Like, what are people's questions? Um, and how might we use data to answer those questions to get to those information needs? So, like, what are some of those fundamental questions that states are trying to answer in this space using data?
Sure. So, and I appreciate your point about curiosity. As I look at the attendee list, I see a lot of very curious people who I've known over the years, and some folks who I haven't met yet, but who are probably just as curious. There's a few big questions that the book highlights as ones that states are in many instances focused on, right? First of all, what's your population of kids, right? That's not even an early childhood question, but like figuring out what is the population of children eligible for the early childhood services you're offering is a first piece that states really are trying to get better at, because as they think about targeting communities, neighborhoods that need services, you really need to have good data there. And again, states have come a long way on that front, but that's a sort of important first question. Once you know who your population is, a second question is who's receiving which services, right? And that speaks to the fragmentation of the early childhood field, that states generally have known which kids are getting state pre-K, which kids are getting childcare. They might have some sense of which kids are getting Head Start, again, because it's federal to local, not always as good. Which kids have gotten home visiting services, which kids are getting special education services. So they may know chunks of that, but what they almost certainly haven't known over the years is what's the cocktail, right? Like what's the combination of, because we know that these services don't exist in isolation, right? There are certainly with special ed, which is a substantial part of the system, many of the children receiving early childhood special education services are also in a childcare or in a preschool or in Head Start, right? And then we talk about Head Start, preschool, and childcare as three separate funding streams, which they are, but at the child and provider level, they are often deeply integrated. And there are numerous kids who are receiving two of the three or even all three in a way that states haven't had a great handle on. So those are basic attendance questions or enrollment questions. And then you get into what kind of experience are those children having, right? And is the experience they're having a high quality experience? What makes it a high quality experience? States have been debating those definitions for years. And the question of, are you tracking that? And then what did it mean, right? Like, how are children doing afterwards? And that connects to a couple of things. One being assessment, which again is a fraught topic in its own right, but one that a lot of states have made some effort on. And then also connecting to a lot of these systems that DQC was integral in advocating for, the K-12 longitudinal data systems, and that connect then on to higher ed and the workforce. Because even though, again, you have to be very careful about how you're using the data, as early childhood people, we should be curious about what's happening to these kids after they leave our system. And again, there are fair debates to have about pro and con, how much you attribute to the early childhood system. Knowing what happened to children after they left the early childhood system is actually really critical to understanding the impact of the early childhood system. And so having that data, again, it has to be used well, but that you want to have that data in ways that states historically have not, although again, they've built toward it, and some states have at least gotten their pre-K program into the longitudinal data system or starting to add others. So again, we're making headway, and we seem to be on a track to get there.
I hope so. Yeah, you're speaking to like these different types of questions, the more kind of proximate, descriptive, hey, what is happening to kids, families, what are their experiences during this time? And then the longer term, like more longitudinal impact questions. The way we at DQC have framed it has been building horizontally as well as vertically. So you're building that foundation of early childhood data, more connected, higher quality, more complete early childhood data. And then depending, like arguably, if you're trying to answer those more longitudinal questions, how can we connect those better early childhood data with K-12 data, higher ed, and the workforce vertically? So, building horizontally and vertically, ideally in parallel. Those don't have to be necessarily in sequence, but having that complete longitudinal picture enables asking and answering just like the various questions, policy questions that are top of mind for folks. So, um, yeah, I like getting to kind of so people have questions, but like who are the people? Like I know your book touched on that a lot, but like let's start with like kind of the leaders in states, like those sorts of folks. Like how well, I think the overarching question is like, how can states work towards that culture of data use and inquiry? But it starts with like those leaders in states. So like, what are some of those like characteristics of those data leaders in states, and maybe what are some states that are leading on that front?
Sure. Well, it starts with curiosity, as I said before, right? Because if you are running a state early childhood system, I think for better, we are not at a point as a field where any state can say, yeah, like we've just cracked the nut, and if we can just maintain what we have, we should be fine, right? There are a lot of states that have done an incredible amount of good work, but there is no state that is looking at its entire early childhood system and saying, yeah, like we're at maintenance, right? So ideally, the folks in charge of early childhood agencies or early childhood units within larger agencies are deeply curious and feel a sense of urgency about improvement and see data as essential to making that improvement, right? Again, they want to know how they're expanding services, whether they're delivering quality, and whether, again, in the long run, those experiences are having the intended impact. So what you've seen is as states have created some of this infrastructure, it's essentially creating a new set of jobs, right? I mean, that there wasn't an early childhood commissioner or deputy commissioner in states 20, 30 years ago, again, with a few exceptions like Georgia and Washington and Massachusetts, which were the early adopters, but that now those jobs exist. And the people in those jobs, again, are typically political appointees. They feel that sense of urgency. And again, every person in those roles is different and they have their different angles, but you're seeing some folks who really have that curiosity and are leading the work necessary to build the infrastructure that produces the data. So I'm not gonna, I'm going to give an incomplete answer, but I would say a few of the folks in those roles who I've known who I think of as super data driven. I mean, if you go historically in Pennsylvania, Harriet Dichter was one of the pioneers of both leading a new early childhood agency and using data to do it. Connecticut has had a strong data culture as it's created its agency. Certainly, Jenna Conway in Virginia has built a ton of infrastructure in various ways and in various partnerships that produce data and are using it aggressively. New Mexico with Elizabeth Gruginski, and then I'm going to express my hometown bias, but here in Illinois, where I'm based, the new Department of Early Childhood, Teresa Ramos is the head of that agency and is really working on some very exciting infrastructure for data that, again, the agency is not up and running yet, but that's in the pipeline. This is not to say, by the way, that only states that have created data, unified agencies are going to be able to produce good data. And you've seen some really exciting data work taking places in states that don't have that standalone agency, right? Iowa is certainly one that comes to mind. Some of the work that South Carolina has done on parent portals, right? And again, South Carolina's governance structure looks a little different than some states, but that they have been really committed to improving data infrastructure. So the two aren't necessarily identical, but it is certainly the case that a number of states, when they've created these new governance structures and leadership roles, the people in those leadership roles have been champions for better data as part of their improvement strategy.
Absolutely. And that has been a DQC, I mean, 20th anniversary. We've been around, but that has been a finding of DQCs over time in this broader P20W data space. Having those data champions from local to state level for sure, but particularly in that kind of executive leadership role is just key in terms of driving the work forward and sustaining it. So yeah, like don't want to call you out, Elliot, but you're a lawyer, and one of the like biggest kind of insights I've gotten from you over time is this idea of like legal capacity as well, like that side of people. So yeah, could you speak more to that? Like, and you mentioned like consolidated state agencies. There's inherent kind of data sharing and integration. If we're talking about data and that consolidation, but there needs to be kind of legal capacity to support that. So could you speak to that a bit?
Absolutely. And I will say, my first job in education policy was in the Illinois governor's office. And one of my first responsibilities was to find a general counsel for the State Board of Education who was going to help us implement our agenda. And we were able to find both a counsel and a deputy counsel who were very much of the mindset of like, we are here to help you accomplish your goals. And we're going to tell you how to do that legally, but like we get that like you have policy goals you're trying to achieve, and that our job is to make those come to life in a legal way. That is not the experience that, so I was spoiled, right, getting to work with lawyers like that, but that is not the experience that everyone has had with state government lawyers. Um, there are some great ones, and I've had a chance to work with some great ones. There are others who, again, I don't want to say they're not great, but that this is not their background, right? They don't come from an area of expertise with data integration and data structures, and they are cautious, right? Like if you're a sort of riverboat gambler lawyer type, you're probably not going to be working in state government. And so what ends up happening is lawyers are looking at the legal infrastructure to produce data, and they are anxious because you see stories and they're real about security breaches or privacy errors, and that those are actually bad things when they happen, and that the lawyers appropriately see as part of their job preventing that from happening. But what happens in some instances is there's a little bit of over prevention, and that there are both legal and ethical actions that could be happening that are prevented because either the lawyers are being overly cautious, or in some instances, what happens is the lawyers just sort of slow walk processes. And unless someone is really leaning on them to approve that, work on that data integration agreement or data sharing agreement, they're not in a rush to get that done, right? Like, so which is all totally understandable from their perspective, right? Like this is not meant to be a criticism of government lawyers, but it does speak to what their incentives are. And this again is where leadership has mattered. I mean, for one thing, the creation of integrated early childhood agencies removes some of the legal barriers to data production because a lot of privacy laws are focused on sharing data across agencies, and that sharing within agencies from a legal standpoint is a lot easier, and there's fewer legal barriers to that. So that simplifies the process in one way. But what it also does is, again, create somebody in a position of authority who can tell their counsel, look, like, this is important to us operationally, let's get this done. In many instances, historically, when there was work being done on data integration, you had a division within a large human services agency whose head might be two or three rungs down on the org chart from the agency head. And similarly, like a pre-K unit within an education agency whose director was two or three rungs down from the agency head. And that those people are trying to get help from their respective lawyers to integrate data. But if the agency heads aren't babysitting that, then it's going to keep falling to the bottom of the list. State agencies have a never-ending parade of legal fires to put out, right? So it really takes someone in charge saying this is really important and making sure that it happens. Um, And again, doing so in a way that is absolutely protective of privacy and security because you cannot compromise on that. But there are ways to produce, from a policy standpoint, much of what you're looking for is aggregated data. So you need to have the accurate underlying data, but you're not trying to release anybody's personal information to the public. And so there are ways to do this that are legal and ethical and operational. It just takes some work at the front end to get that set up.
You're hitting on like for DQC, it's this like privacy and access, like it's both and. Like privacy has to be centered, protecting data, um, at every kind of step in like the data process. But this idea of like putting the data to use, like if there's not access, if there's not like informed, approved use of that data, then why are we collecting it in the first place? Like, what is the purpose? So that idea of like data use providing kind of clarity of purpose, like why are we collecting these data? Why do we need to protect them? I think having that privacy and access is both and has been something that DQC's really tried to hit on and has resonated with their audiences over time, for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a cost benefit, and there are real costs,
Mhm.
right? Which, again, agency lawyers are usually very good at pointing out. It's not really the agency lawyer's job to articulate all the benefits. That's going to have to come from agency leadership and the policy people. And so part of our job is to articulate those benefits and talk about how having the data will allow us to improve our operations, to better serve children, and that the impact of data can impact in some states, hundreds of thousands of millions of children. So that is a real benefit too. And we've just got to make sure that those are weighed. And again, it's not an either or, it's a both and. It just takes some leadership and process to get there.
That's right. That's right. So we talked about the lawyers, but like children and families and like communities, providers, like folks on the ground locally, like obviously they have questions too, and they're key players in early childhood systems. So just like curious, how might states engage those folks to like identify their questions, understand them, work towards answering them, and then deliver those answers back to local folks so they can actually, use the data.
No, it's a great question. And the thing is, within the early childhood system, there are so many audiences who have different data needs, and there are different ways to meet them, right? I mean, from a family perspective, families are actually probably much less worried about the system as a whole. They want to know, like, how can I get the service I want for my kid, right? And so I referenced South Carolina earlier. Certainly, they're not the only state, but they've been one of the leading states in trying to make it easier for families to find the service they need and then enroll in it easily. And that ultimately, I mean, again, we're not all the way there yet, but that this is both a technology and a human issue, right? Like you need a good data system, and then you need actual people who can help families navigate the system. But that ideally, we'll get to the point where, the families can go on a website and identify not just like which programs are in their area, but which programs are in their area and for which they are eligible and who have seats right now, right? I mean, in a lot of states, certainly with regard to childcare, there are long wait lists. With pre-K, there's not always spots in a classroom. Same with Head Start. And so, first of all, to understand really what are my real options, right? So that I don't have to make 15 phone calls or send 15 emails. But then, on top of that, to be able to enroll, or apply for enrollment in multiple services through a minimally burdensome process, right? And there's going to be some amount of burden. You're going to have to fill out some amount of forms. It may not be possible for states to just create like one form that covers everything. But at the very least, again, one of the things South Carolina did was made it so that if you are filling out one form and then you start doing a second one, any data that overlaps from one to the other will just be pre-populated, so you don't have to plug it all in again, right? And that is at least an incremental change that makes it a little bit easier. So those kinds of things can be helpful for families. And again, like one of the things I've argued is that the state should be the holder of the backbone data infrastructure, but how it's used at the local level might vary, right? So you might want to have, and different states have different local structures for early childhood. You might want to have community level conversations about, hey, like what data do we want to see about ourselves? What data do our providers need to operate? What data do our families want? And you might have dashboards in different parts of the state that look a little different, and that's okay, right? But if the state's got usable, accessible data and that they're pushing it out in ways that are aggregated, and privacy is protected, but that are useful to different audiences, there's no reason you can't do some there's no reason other than capacity and will that you can't do some amount of customization to meet different needs in different places. And again, potentially have data focused on the needs of providers, on the needs of families, and other possible end users, that and that's an engagement issue, right? I mean, and again, I know this is something DQC has always been strong on, but like, don't assume if you're the state, ask. People will probably be happy to tell you. And when you look at the most successful state data websites, initiatives, whatever, they generally started with the state going to the stakeholders for whom the data is meant and saying, hey, like, what do you need? And some of it may be possible, some of it may not be, but at least asking at the outset and then listening to people and perhaps iterating a bit on what's possible, like that's the way to go about producing that.
Full disclosure, both Elliot and I are Illinois residents, Chicago area folks, and Elliot, that's been something that's been really encouraging to me as they're standing up IDEC, this really intentional process where the state has, I mean, on a number of fronts standing up this agency, but on the data front, like try to be really intentional about getting some of that more local input on their needs and how, this is an opportunity to build fresh for the state of Illinois, early childhood data infrastructure, and that's what they're doing. But like really understanding the needs of folks, their information needs, and how the state might build infrastructure to better meet those needs. I've been very encouraged by just this intentional engagement process that they've led as in the run up to the agency's launch here in July. So it's been good.
And there have been other kinds of stakeholder engagement processes, right? And not all of which have been run by state government. So just as an example, there are a number of states that have dashboards that are looking at the whole early childhood system, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes including health or other data. And sometimes, Texas, in Texas, Texans Care for Children did brought together a group of leaders and experts and pulled together a dashboard and are using that to measure progress in the state, right? So this can happen at multiple levels. Again, if you start with curiosity, you want to ask people, what do you want to know? What do you need to know? And build from there.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think we've hit the demand side. That needs to be in place, like inquiry, starting with questions. Um, let's shift to the supply side now. So you kind of spoke a bit to, um, data systems, the technology, and as, has come up to date, like the technology of early childhood data systems has been, frankly, kind of antiquated, fit for a purpose, not necessarily the purpose of data use. But some states are leading the way on that front in terms of modernizing their early childhood data infrastructure. So, like, what is that? And I hate the word modernization, but that's kind of what it is here. Like, how can a state go about modernizing its early childhood data systems?
Sure. Well, and there are a couple of ways that I actually wrote a paper a couple of years ago called "The Importance of Modernizing Data Systems in Early Childhood," right? So I'm keenly aware of both the limits and benefits of the word modernization, but from the technology side, right, the issues look a little differently depending on your audience, right? So on the front end, where you're trying to collect data from folks, you're you're collecting from schools, you're collecting from a wide range of private providers, some of whom are home-based. many of whom have very varying technology, right? Some of them are really tech savvy, some of them are not. But there are ways to strengthen technology use and systems in all of those places, right? And this can also be something that the state does as something of a customer service initiative, right? Is are there ways for the state to pull together and leverage its buying power to say, you know what, like we're not going to make all these people go out and buy their own systems. We're going to support some sort of technology infrastructure. And I know the folks at Opportunities Exchange, which is a partner organization, have done a lot of really important work on that, and have some resources that they can highlight. But that the idea that, again, this world where historically things have been submitted by paper and pencil or through these antiquated systems, there are more modern technologies that not only help with data collection, but in many instances help with the operation of the service itself, right? And using technology to have a better preschool program, a better childcare program, that kind of technology work is valuable. And then there's the back end and what goes on once the data gets to the state. And this is a real challenge, right? Because you have a lot of very antiquated infrastructure, right? When I was writing that paper, I talked to one state that said they were modernizing their data system only because the guy who built it in the 80s was finally retiring. And this was like a few years ago, right? So it is very hard sometimes to, as a state, shift your paradigm from like, we are going to build our bespoke data system that meets our needs in this moment, which again tends to get outdated very quickly, to we are going to become a buyer of technology services where the market is constantly producing new and exciting data. And we are going to actually just be consumers and use data the way, again, the way others in the market do so. Um, you're seeing some amount of that, right? Like in more and more states using the cloud, using modern tools. But it is not always linear and is not always easy. Um, and again, one of the things that happens is if you've got the system that was built 5 to 7 years ago, even though, again, in technology terms, that's a lifetime, it can be very hard to make the case to replace that. And justifying state government funding on data systems is often difficult. It is also the case that almost every state government I've ever talked to has some project in the not too distant past where millions of dollars were spent on some technology project that absolutely did not work, right? And this often speaks to challenges of state procurement processes, which can be very difficult, state contractual management, which again, a lot of the folks who are doing contractual management in state government are not set up to be successful. So when these things go wrong for a variety of reasons, often outside the control of the people actually involved in the project, it makes it very hard to get excited about, oh, like we're going to go out and do this tech correctly. But it is necessary. And again, this is where political leadership becomes important, is someone's just got to say, look, like this technology piece is so important that we must have it. And we're going to make sure that we have an investment in it. And the states that have been successful at using data for impact have had that kind of leadership to build that infrastructure.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, we at DQC like our thing over time, a key thing over time, and in our most recent vision, like integrated data systems. Like you mentioned state longitudinal data systems earlier, but inclusive of early childhood integrated data systems as well. And like Elliot, to your point, like those states that are further along. A lot of states like Early Learning Challenge, like they started building something, but a lot of those states spun out. Those that have kind of continued to build, and I'd say are exemplars now, they've had that leadership over time. But they've also, I think, really prioritized like data governance, and like the kind of laying that foundation of data governance for the state. And I see a Q&A, someone had asked about this. I'll try to address this, but like there's data governance in the technical sense, around like business, like what exactly we're doing with the data, like business rules, change management, that side. But I think DQC's kind of realm is more kind of the people side of data governance. And for us, it's all about kind of clarity of purpose, clarity of responsibility, and clarity of process. That is, you are setting a table of ideally executive or like decision makers across the state, whether within a consolidated agency or across them. You are bringing in representation from all across the sector through like advisory committees. They could have roles on like the governing board, but it's all about setting a relatively inclusive table, wherein you have a sense of kind of the information needs of folks. You're setting a purpose for kind of how we're going about meeting those needs. Um, you are kind of designate like privacy came up, but you're designating responsibility, like who's in charge of making decisions and why, and you're setting a process for how we're collecting, um, storing, and ultimately using data to start delivering information to folks. So um, I think we've seen across states, those states that are leaders, they've made those investments in the technology, but also in the data governance side as well. And like to that end, we at DQC have been encouraged. A number of states lately have looked to codify their early childhood data systems and related governance in law. So we've seen that increasingly through legislation. And I think we at DQC would argue that that is a key step in kind of setting that table, but keeping folks there and adding a bit of accountability and teeth to things to ensure that the conversation starts, but it continues as well. So yeah, I mean, in terms of like integrated data systems, ECIDs or EKIDs, um, I know you mentioned earlier, like it's not necessarily always an easy ask to invest in like data infrastructure, but like I'm curious, like what states are kind of leading on an ECIDs or EKIDs front? Like what have you seen in the field?
Sure. Well, and let me just say on governance, I agree with everything you said and appreciate the question. But one of the things that I do think is important and that the states that are leading are really leaning into is speed. And data doesn't get better as it gets older, right? Like if you have operational needs, you're trying to get data quickly in order to answer them. And that in the aggregate, it's obviously important that data governance be inclusive and that you have representative stakeholders at the table making sure that the system as a whole is producing the data that's useful to people and again being respectful of the communities, right? You want to have the population served be represented in those conversations for sure. That does not mean that every single data request should have a 27-step process to approve it. And that once you've identified the parameters of what your system is supposed to do, the individual data requests, particularly coming from within government, you should be able to act on those quickly. And that one of the struggles states have had is that they've set up governance structures that are meant to give everybody a chance to weigh in on everything. And what that ends up doing is meaning that nothing ever gets produced because nothing happens quickly enough. And then, the folks who actually need data are being held hostage to folks who like are mildly interested, but like this isn't their main thing, right? So I do think that in thinking about your data in governance, all the principles you talked about are key, right? Like I don't want to minimize any of them, but it would be important to make sure that you have a system set up so that when people ask for data, they have a chance to get it quickly. And I actually had an instance once. I was very fortunate. I was in a state that had been developing an integrated data system, and I was literally testifying in a legislative committee and I got asked a question before lunch. And by the time I got back after lunch, I was able to answer it, right? With like up-to-date integrated data because again, I was with someone from a state agency who made a request. It was data that we knew we had, and we just turned it around like that, right? That's the kind of thing. And the legislators like absolutely had no idea what to make of it. This had never happened to them before. So that's the kind of thing that, again, it's not always going to be that rapid, but that you want to be responsive and that when people ask questions that they need like this week, you want to be able to answer them this week. In terms of what states have been on the vanguard of this, again, I think that it maps to some of the states that have been really curious. And again, I know I'm going to leave some states out, but that I've been really impressed with some of the work that's been done in Iowa, right? Like the I2D2, and I'm forgetting exactly what that stands for, but that have put together some really great data, and it's been a really collaborative effort led out of Iowa State University. Virginia's been putting together some good data, and then some of the older states that have had agencies for longer, like Georgia and Massachusetts, have been real leaders in trying to integrate data. Again, they're able to do it within an individual agency context, but that they have pulled together data and created analytics units to use that data effectively, which I think is a key part of this. So you're definitely seeing some of those states. And again, I'm hoping Illinois will soon be on the list. But again, not to, there may be others that I'm not remembering in the moment, but those are a few that I think of as states that have made, significant headway on early childhood data.
Yeah, absolutely. Fingers crossed here in Illinois for sure. Yeah, I like what I think something from you a lot resonated from your book. Again, highly recommended Readiness. Check it out. But like technology, like quick wins, like it's a concept in from kind of tech, but like an MVP, like a minimal viable product. Like how can we build something again informed by needs with purpose in mind? How can we build something and start delivering value relatively quickly? And with the understanding that the system will improve over time. It has to. And as people see that value, they have questions that are answered like over lunch, perhaps. But within a day, a week, relatively quickly, they'll start to see that value, they'll start to buy in, and you build momentum and go from there. So like aiming for those quick wins, I think has been key. And you mentioned Iowa, like South Carolina's come up, Virginia. Um, those three states, like DQC had highlighted them in a resource that we have put out about 18 months ago now. But like knowing that those states have really delivered that value pretty quickly and like built something and got it out there. And now they continue to improve what they built from there.
This
So that's been huge.
Yeah, this is definitely an area where you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the useful, right? And again, the South Carolina folks would, in talking to them multiple times, have always said like we're working to get better, but we're working to get better with a product out there that's actually serving families well today, right? And it is the case that for certain policy decisions, and again, this is something where I am not a statistician, but from talking to people who are, right? There are times where good data now is going to be way more useful than perfect data not now, right? So if you're making resource allocation decisions and let's say that the state is trying to focus on like, how are we building up our capacity in the communities that need it most, right? So, I think the example I use in the book is if you see one community where 80% of eligible children are getting service and another community where 40% of eligible children are getting service, that 80 might be closer to 90. It might be more like 70. The 40 could be anywhere from 50 to 30, right? Like there might be some play in the joints depending on the quality of your data. But for purposes of figuring out where your next dollar should go, you know which of those communities has a greater need, right? And so when you are dealing with population level data and relatively broad policy initiatives, right? you don't need the level of precision that you need for like a case management system. So again, like you want to make sure if you've got case management systems that those are really precise. But at the policy level, just starting to build the culture of, hey, actually, we've got some data that tells us enough to answer the question in front of us. And it doesn't answer some of these other questions, maybe that we really ought to be able to answer. But like, let's answer the question we've got for now and move forward. That's part of building the culture. And again, like you're not, for policy questions, there are often times where like a little bit of variance isn't actually that big a deal. And so again, take good data if you can get it and use it for those purposes and start to build the case for now that we've done that, here are other questions that if we could answer them even more precisely, we could be even more effective. That's a cycle, right? And so you just have to get into the right cycle. The vicious cycle that states get trapped in is they can't produce useful data, so they stop asking, and then you can't justify maintaining the infrastructure to produce data because you're not actually producing anything.
Mhm.
You got to get out of that. You got to be producing something that you can use, using it as best you can, and then continuing to learn on the fly and growing toward a point where you have the kind of comprehensive data that I think many of us on this call would love to see states have.
That's right. That's right. Um, yeah, and so with that, I think we will open it up. Again, please feel free to throw any questions in the Q&A, and we will be able to, I think, hit two, like at least two, maybe three questions. So yeah, please feel free to add questions to the Q&A.
Yeah. And we did have a question, which I responded to privately and would love to hear back from, but that, you know, the person correctly pointed out that this conversation has been a lot for people who work in the field and sort of may have started knowing a little something about how data systems work. And speaking more broadly, right, from an early childhood field perspective, we have always been I think we've always been a little bit nervous about data in a few different ways. I mean, one is, again, we haven't had it, so we haven't had the experience of using it effectively. Um, we know that a lot of the data we've collected isn't entirely accurate, right? In part largely because both the systems that we built to collect it weren't that great, and the people responsible for collecting it are desperately underpaid, and that if that data isn't really useful to them, and they're filling out a paper form at the end of a long day, and they know that probably, there's almost sort of a tacit understanding that like no one's really going to look at it that carefully in some instances, right? Obviously, the stuff that relates to payments going to get looked at, but other things like people may not be. So we know that there's a mess with that. And historically, there's always been a real concern that data is going to be used against us some way, right? That like if people see some of the things that are happening, rather than say, oh, like we need to get better, they'll say, oh, we should just stop doing this. And for a field that has been deeply underfunded throughout the course of its history and remains so to this day, like that's never going to truly go away. That is part of what the leadership at the state level is necessary to overcome is building that trust to your point earlier, right? Where people see, oh, wait a minute, someone's using data in a way that benefits me, in a way that leads to additional resources, in a way that's helping children get served effectively, right? We haven't had that culture and it's not going to emerge overnight. And so, optimists like me and you, Charlie, and some of the other folks on this call, we need that optimism, but we also need to be realistic about where a lot of our colleagues are coming from and recognize that the very act of producing data is fraught. Because the thing is, data is only necessary if you're trying to change something, right? If you want everything to be the
That's right.
same, you don't really need data, right? So, and change is scary in a field where a lot of the change hasn't been good.
Mhm.
So, if you look in the broader arc of the last 20 years, the field is definitely in a much better place now than it was, when I got started back in 2004, or even, going a few years before that. But it hasn't been linear. It hasn't been, progress for everybody,
Mhm.
even if it's been progress in the aggregate. And so it's important to just be mindful that part of the power of data to change things, that is not always used for good, and that the people who are anxious about that are anxious about it for good reason. And to make sure that we're thinking about that as we're trying to build the infrastructure needed to accomplish what I think are some very important goals that a lot of us on this call have.
Absolutely. And Elliot, you're hitting on the old DQC chestnut, data as a flashlight, not a hammer. Knowing that data has in early childhood and elsewhere across education and workforce, like data has been used as that hammer over time, and there's real trepidation around that. And so, like, how can states work to build that culture of data use and move towards data as a flashlight, or ideally, as we just just cut the lights on? Like,
Yeah, right.
how
Like,
can we? Yeah, exactly.
no, I was reading an article recently where the author talked about having a flashlight and said, but the thing about the flashlight is you're still in the dark. And so let's think about it like a floodlight, right? Like, how are we turning on the floodlights and just having the data we need for all kinds of operational benefits? That's the world I envision, and it's not going to happen this year, but hopefully we're on our way.
Absolutely,
And Charlie, there's
absolutely.
a question about
Hmm.
rewatchability that I will defer to you and maybe as a sort of good note to
Hmm.
end on.
Absolutely. So we are being recorded today. We will make that recording available. Again, thank you all for joining. Let me share my screen quickly to close this out here. So again, Elliot, thank you so much for taking part today. And so again, Elliot's book, Readiness, check it out. Great beach poolside read. I hear it's great for book clubs as well. So please check that out. I mentioned this DQC resource as well. Our DQC use cases transforming state early childhood data. So please check those out. I'll pause for folks to get those QR codes. But yeah, while y'all are doing that, we have another webinar coming up next month, June 11th, trying to answer the question, what's possible with better early childhood funding data? So that will be a panel. I'm really excited. We'll have expert panelists from the Center for Early Learning Funding Equity, from Children's Funding Project, and also prenatal to five fiscal strategies. So really excited about that. That is June 11th, 1 p.m. Eastern. What's possible with better early childhood funding data? Stay tuned for registration information. But till then, again, thank you all for joining us today and take good care.